Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, we do have a gambling regulatory authority of Ireland now, which is, in theory, at least a fantastic idea. I think the authority is still, I think, seemingly very reliant on the industry gambling awareness trust stroke gambling care, isn't it, Frank?
It must be said there do seem to be some links there, and these links are a little bit worrying. We've seen this in tobacco, we see it in alcohol, we're seeing it in gambling. The gambling industry, in this case, is basically promoting what has the official status of a charity. But there's no denying, I don't think, that it's essentially to serve their purposes. And I think if you look at the gambling regulator site at the moment, it does mention Gambling Care, which is one of the groups funded by the Gambling Awareness Trust, which, as I say, is funded by the gambling industry. And that's an issue. And I think they need to break those links. I think one thing we need to remember is the UK had this situation. They had Gamble Aware, which was providing services, and it actually had a formal contract with the National Health Service in the UK. But when they came to renew that contract, there was such a pushback from people using the service that they felt they couldn't sort of continue with that contract. And what worries me, and the timing on this is really quite scary. What worries me is literally within 1, 2, or 3 months of it having been rejected in the UK, what do we see in Ireland? The same sort of thing starts happening in Ireland. So I have serious questions. So when they stopped offering those kind of services in the UK, they started offering them in Ireland under the auspices of this sort of Gambling Awareness Trust and Gambling Care. There's a few issues that we need to think about when you have something like the Gambling Awareness Trust or Gambling Care providing services, paying for research. I'll just give you some examples if you don't mind. So one of the things that's happening is that Gambling Care or the Gambling Awareness Trust, I think you can essentially think of them both as the same entity. They've now set up a national problem gambling support service, which my understanding was going to go into 20 family support centres across Ireland. Now, don't get me wrong, we know these services are required, but it's a real issue when it's the gambling industry that are funding them directly. And if you think why, that doesn't make sense. Why would that be? Well, the reason is because it gives the gambling industry a respectability. It gives the gambling industry a legitimacy. It gives them credibility. And to be honest, the gambling industry is part of the addictions industry. It's like tobacco. It's like alcohol. And when it gets these links, it gets a prestige that it shouldn't have, to my mind. Another thing that they're doing is they're funding gambling addiction training. So, for example, I think if you go to MTU, Munster Technological University, you can get 70% of your fees paid while doing a certificate in gambling addiction. Okay. And again, you might say, well, sure, isn't that great? The industry paying back maybe part of its debt. But the important thing to remember here is the industry is worth somewhere in the region 5, 7, 10 billion a year. And they're throwing a pittance at these kind of things that they would probably call corporate social responsibility, that I would call camouflage, that allows them to continue to operate. And another thing that Gambling Care, Gambling Awareness Trust are doing is they're funding research. And this, I work in Technological University of the Shannon, and for me, this really, really rings alarm bells. We've seen it with tobacco. Under the big legal agreements that happened in America, a lot of the industry files, memos, and that came to light. They were required by law to be passed over to the public domain, and we see in there the strategies that these industries use. They fund certain types of research. They fund research that serves their purposes. They fund, maybe, let's take gambling as an example. They fund research on sort of really heavy addiction gambling. Why? Because then it seems like it's only this small, teeny little percentage of the population who have a problem. But we know the problem is much wider than that. The Economic and Social Research Institute did a study just a couple of years ago. And, we only have a population of about 5 million. But they identified something like 170,000 people would count as being problem gamblers. Okay? Sorry, my mistake. There's 130,000. I apologize. 130,000 people as problem gamblers and 270,000 with problematic gambling. Essentially, we're talking 400,000 people who have some sort of gambling issue, and that shouldn't be glossed over. The industry's throwing a little bit of money at these sort of good projects. We can't afford to let that sort of diminish the harmful impact that the industry has. Their message, because remember, it's in their financial interest. Their message is always going to be kind of gamble responsibly, gamble within limits, because they don't want people turning away from gambling.